Hello everyone, in this lecture I'd like to talk about Aristotle's general account of virtue, what human virtue is in general and what is its relationship to happiness. In the next video I'll go into a little bit more about his account of some of the particular virtues and how that sets you up, and I'll discuss your next writing assignment, which will be based on his account of the particular virtues. Well, what is a virtue, or what is virtue? Most generally, as we talked about last time, a virtue is just any good quality of a thing that helps it to complete its nature or to fulfill its function well. This was one of the key ingredients for happiness, according to Aristotle's definition from section 7 of Book 1. Here what he wants to do is fill out that general definition of virtue more completely, explaining more about how we get virtues, distinguishing different kinds of virtues, distinguishing virtue from other conditions that we can be in or other things. So as he says on page 27 in Book 2, he says, every virtue, regardless of what thing it is the virtue of, both completes the good state of that thing and makes it perform its function well. As, for example, the virtue of an eye makes both the eye and its function excellent, since it is by dint of the eye's virtue that we see well. Similarly, the virtue of a horse makes the horse excellent, that is, good at running, carrying its rider, and standing firm against enemies. If, then, this holds in every case, the virtue of a human being will also be the state by dint of which he becomes a good human being and will perform his own function well. So in other words, then, once again, a virtue is then an excellent characteristic of a thing that allows it to perform its function well and to complete its nature. And so what he does at the beginning of Book 2 is he distinguishes between two general kinds of virtues, and these correspond to two different ways of describing human nature. So if a virtue is what something is a good quality that allows you to be complete in your nature, we need to get a better understanding of what the nature of a human being is. Well, there's two ways of getting at this. The first way of getting at what a human being is to say that we are rational animals. We are animals, we are living things of a particular sort, but what makes us unique is our rationality. And so we are rational animals. And so there will be various virtues, various good qualities that can help us to complete our nature in that respect as rational animals. But as Aristotle says elsewhere, not only are we rational animals, but what's also interesting about us is that we are political or social animals. What this means is that we naturally and essentially live in communities. We depend on being in community and being involved in communities, not only for our survival, but for our doing well. Part of what's so hard about being in lockdown right now is that we feel like something is missing. Something is making our lives less than complete. And a large part of what's missing is the communal aspect, our inability to engage in the same sort of social and communal practices that we're used to that help us to live well and to be happy. So we are both rational animals, and there are various virtues that will help us to live up to that description, to fulfill that aspect of our natures, but also political or social creatures. And so there are various virtues or good qualities that will help us to complete that nature, or to live up to our potential in that respect, to fulfill our function as social creatures. Now, the name that Aristotle gives for these two general kinds of virtues are intellectual virtues and moral virtues. And the intellectual virtues are ones that develop the mind. They are good qualities of your mind that help you to live up to your full nature as a rational animal. So there are things like being a good critical thinker, being a careful reader, being able to see from multiple perspectives, being able to reply to objections or come up with good objections to other thoughts, having the sort of patience to wade through long and difficult things, having a sort of mental perseverance. These are all good qualities. These are all intellectual virtues that will allow you to fulfill your function well as a rational creature. These, Aristotle says, these virtues, these good qualities, we get principally by being taught them. So I, as your professor, can teach you a little bit about how to think critically, about how to read difficult texts and get the main points from them, and how to come up with persuasive arguments and how to present them in a clear and concise way. Um, Being able to brainstorm possible ways around a particular conclusion. These are all things that I can teach you. These are all things that you can get. These are all virtues, good qualities in yourself that you can get by being taught them. Moral virtues, on the other hand, qualities that help you to live well with others and so to fulfill your nature as a social creature, are things like courage and generosity, kindness, patience, honesty, these sorts of things that allow you to live well with other people. These sorts of things, Aristotle says, these virtues, these good qualities, are not something that can simply be taught. The way in which we get these virtues, these good qualities, is by making them habits, by practicing the sorts of actions that correspond to the good quality. So, for example, let's talk about the virtue of patience, for example, which actually isn't one that Aristotle mentions, but it's one of my favorites. Patience as a virtue, it means, right, that you have a good quality of responding patiently in difficult times. How did you get to be patient? Importantly, according to Aristotle, in order for something to count as a moral virtue, it can't be what you start out with. It can't be what you're naturally born with. Some people are naturally kind or naturally patient or naturally courageous. But Aristotle says that, strictly speaking, anything you start out with wouldn't be a moral virtue. You don't get, right, the credit for that one. So how you get them then? Patience as a moral virtue is the sort of thing that you get through practice. By when confronted with difficult or trying situations, you act patiently. What Aristotle says is eventually, given enough circumstances and given enough practice of constantly performing patient actions, you will do it so many times that it starts to become, in a way, second nature. In other words, you will have practiced patience so many times that the next time in which you're presented with the opportunity, you do it, you are patient without even thinking about it. So getting the moral virtues for Aristotle is a bit like learning how to play a musical instrument. At first, it seems really unnatural when you're trying to learn how to play guitar. You're thinking about, well, gosh, my fingers aren't supposed to go that way when you place them on the frets. But anyone who's learned a musical instrument knows that, right, after hours and weeks and months and years of practice, it gets easier. At a certain point when you're learning how to play the guitar, you don't even have to look at your fingers anymore. They just know where to go along the frets in order to correspond to the chords. So this practice until it becomes almost second nature is how Aristotle is understanding moral virtue. And so, once again, in order to have the moral virtue of kindness or generosity or patience or honesty, it's not the sort of thing you're born with, it's the sort of thing you get through practice by repeatedly performing the right sort of thing until it becomes a habit. Now, there are things that you can perform the wrong sorts of actions, and you can habituate those as well. Those are the bad habits. He'll call those moral vices. Those are the bad ones. But the virtues are when you habituate the right sorts of actions, when you perform the right sort of action over and over again until it becomes second nature. But there's another important aspect of how we get moral virtues. According to Aristotle, it's not just about practicing and practicing and practicing until it becomes second nature. It's not just that you become disposed to act in a particular way in a particular set of circumstances. He thinks there's one extra part that's required for something to count as a moral virtue. And the extra thing that's required is that he thinks that you need to no longer find it difficult to do the sort of thing that you've habituated. And you need to take pleasure in it. It's no longer painful for you to do it. So, for example, it's something like this. According to Aristotle, you don't have the moral virtue of generosity. Even if you respond in the right sorts of ways in the right sort of circumstances, you don't have the virtue of generosity until it has become easy for you to give to those in need, until it's no longer difficult, until it's no longer painful. When you don't even think about the plans you had for the money, you just think about how this person needs it. When it's no longer painful for you to give up that money and you take pleasure in it, That's when you have the moral virtue. Now, you might think that taking pleasure in something, right, is just a matter of taste, right? I just don't like being patient, and that's all there is to it. According to Aristotle, that's wrong on two accounts. On the one hand, right, what he's saying is that for the sort of person who says, well, I'm just not a naturally patient person, he's saying, well, then get to work. You've got work to do. On the other hand, right, you say, well, I have become much more patient, but I still don't like it. Aristotle's response to that is to say, keep going, right? You still have more work to do. Now you've habituated the right sorts of dispositions, but you still have further work to do. You now have to condition your own tastes and preferences. The example I use to illustrate this further component is something like this. We got two characters. We got Bobby and we got Susie, right? So I'll talk about Bobby. Bobby goes to the crow's nest every day there for lunch. And Bobby goes towards the back and right he walks past the salad and says, no, I don't want any of that, right? I'm going to get the pizza and the ice cream. So he gets the pizza and the ice cream. But then one day he decides, okay, no, I have to start eating better, right? So I'm going to try to eat the salad. And the first couple times when he does it, right, it's he instinctively walks back to the pizza and the ice cream, but he stops himself and says, no, I got to eat the salad this time. And so he has to constantly remind himself, right, for several occasions until eventually, right, he no longer has to remind himself. Now he just, right, walks toward the salad bar when he walks into the lunchroom. He has habituated his actions such that he is disposed to choose correctly. But maybe Bobby, when you sit him down and you ask him, oh, okay, well, I see you've been eating salad a lot lately. You've been adjusting your diet. How's that going for you? He's like, well, I'm doing the right thing, he might say, but I don't like it. I really would love to eat the pizza and the ice cream. When he looks over to the delicious pizza glistening in the light, and he looks over at the cool, refreshing ice cream, and he thinks to himself, that's what I really want. I have conditioned myself to choose the salad, but what I really want is the pizza and the ice cream. I don't want the salad. I don't want the broccoli. I don't have much of a taste for this. That's Bobby. Now let's talk about Susie. So Susie also goes to the crow's nest every day for lunch, and she used to eat the pizza and the ice cream, but she too, through practice, has habituated herself to go towards the salad bar to get a nice salad and some broccoli for lunch. Now, when you sit Susie down, right, and you ask her how are things going, and she says, "Oh yeah, well, I didn't really like salad or the broccoli at first, but now I actually kind of like it. And now I look over at that sort of greasy pizza, and I don't really even crave it anymore. I look at the ice cream and I think, ah, too sweet. I'd rather have the salad and the broccoli." Now, notice the difference between Bobby and Susie. They're both doing the same thing. But what's missing, right, in Bobby that's present in Susie? According to Aristotle, only Susie has the moral virtue of temperance. Bobby does not yet have the moral virtue of temperance. Even though he's doing the same thing, he has not yet conditioned his preferences. And so what's cool about this kind of moral virtue that we get from Aristotle is it means that our moral character, is plastic, is flexible in two ways. One is that we can dispose ourselves to act in ways that we want. So if you don't like that you're not a patient person, you can condition yourself to become that sort of person. The other way in which our moral character is plastic or flexible is that we can condition our own tastes and preferences. He thinks that it's very much up to you what sort of person you are and what you take pleasure in. He says that's up to you. You have some work to do if your dispositions to act and if your preferences are not where they should be. Now, how plausible is that? Well, I don't know. I think about some occasions in which I don't know, when I was a kid, started growing up in the 90s, what a glorious time that was, right? Drank a lot of soda pop. And I used to drink it all the time and loved it and thought that something was missing when I wasn't drinking the soda pop. But then at a certain point, maybe at college, I decided that I was going to give up that stuff. I wasn't going to drink any more soda pop. And now when I go back to drinking soda pop, when I do have an occasion, I don't take a whole lot of tremendous joy in it, right? Sort of, it almost seems sort of like caustic, right? You get a nice Dr. Pepper and you think, oh my gosh, how could I ever like drink this every day? What's happened is that my preferences have shifted, in part because I've shifted my actions, maybe part because I also kind of became an adult, but because I've conditioned my actions, I've also worked to condition my preferences. I no longer crave the soda pop, not nearly as much as I used to. And I think this is part of what Aristotle's insight is here. That in order to have a moral virtue, you not only need to practice until some disposition comes second nature, you also have to condition your preferences or your tastes, your pleasures, so that they line up, such that you don't even have sort of a desire that goes against the sorts of actions that you are disposed to perform. Let's see, what else are we going to talk about? Well, there's a section that talks about how, so far we've got our two kinds of virtues. We've got a general account of virtue, according to which a virtue is a good quality that helps it to live up to its full nature and fulfill its function. Then we got two kinds of virtues. We got intellectual virtues for us, which develop us as rational animals, and moral virtues, which develop us as social or political animals. And we talked about the moral virtues, how we get them through practice, through conditioning your actions, and conditioning your preferences. What we get here is an account according to which virtue is a kind of state that you're in. It's not just particular actions that you perform. You are in a state, you are disposed to behave in a particular way. It's a way in which you are, right? It's a way in which you've habituated yourself to be. So it's a kind of state that you're in. And so virtues then must be states. There's a section in the text where he distinguishes then between feelings, capacities, and states. And he says that virtues turn out to be states. But what kind of state is a virtue? Well, here's what we get at about a little more than midway through book 2. He works up, what he's been working up in the first half of book 2 is something like a definition of virtue with several key ingredients that correspond to, or that is complex and lists the ingredient much the same as he listed the ingredients in his complex definition of happiness. So I was working up to that. So far, we've got some of the key notions of what a virtue is. Maybe there are two other key ingredients that I should discuss before we introduce his full definition of virtue. So far, we've got the idea that a moral virtue is not in us by nature, but it's something that we condition ourselves to have. It's about how we're disposed to act, but it's also the conditioning of our pleasures and tastes to correspond to what sorts of actions we should be practicing and not according to those that we should not. But how do we know what sort of actions we should be habituating? I've talked generally about some good qualities, so patient acts, acts of kindness, acts of generosity, acts of courage. But how should we know what sort of actions we should be habituating, that we should be disposed to perform? Well, Aristotle gives us two guidelines here, two principles, two rules that we can use to help us figure out what sort of actions we should be habituating. They're called the principle of the mean and the exemplar principle. So let's talk first about the principle of the mean. What he says here is that the sort of action that you should be aiming for, and indeed the sort of state that you should be aiming for, should be somewhere in the middle between two extremes. The other name maybe for the principle of the mean we could give to it is something like the Goldilocks principle. What he says is that there are two ways in which you can be mistaken in what sort of actions you perform. With respect to a particular domain of good things, things that you should be pursuing, things that you should be acting towards, things that you should be desiring, it says that you can be mistaken in two ways. One, right, is you can err on the side of not enough. Two, you can err on the side of too much. So you can think about it in the case of, well, you're wondering how much food you should eat. It might be funny to think about this as a moral virtue, but according to Aristotle, it is a moral virtue, making sure that you are eating the right sorts of things and the right amount. It's the virtue of temperance, principally. And so when you think about how much you need to eat, well, you can think about how you can make a mistake by eating way too much. You can also make a mistake by not eating enough. So the general guideline is you should be aiming for somewhere in the middle. Aim for that act that is reasonable, right? The one that is somewhere in the middle, the mean or the median, right? So that's the principle of the mean. It thinks that, well, you identify the extremes and you look somewhere in the middle. And that's a rough guideline for what sorts of actions you should be performing. Now, as he does say importantly later on, there are certain sorts of things that don't admit of the mean, things that you should never do because they're directly contrary to human flourishing or directly contrary to happiness. Things like theft and murder and adultery and things of that sort. But for good things, right, there is, even with respect to good things, too much and too little. And so we have to aim for a proper balance there. The other principle he gives us for helping us to figure out what sort of states we should habituate and what sort of actions we should perform is something called the exemplar principle, which I think is a really important principle. What he tells us is that how do you know what sort of actions to perform? How do you know what sort of states to habituate? He says, well, find an exemplar. Find a great example of moral virtue in your life or from the past. Think about some individual or individuals that are uncontroversially virtuous, that everyone would regard as this was a truly good person. And so he says, once you got your exemplar, once you got your ideal, then you ask yourself, what would this person do? What are the particular actions that this person would do? What are the particular states that this person has? So you identify the ideal person, the exemplar, and then you try to break down how that person would perform or what sort of states that person has. If the principle of the mean is kind of like the Goldilocks principle, then the exemplar principle is kind of like the what would Jesus do principle. It tells us to look at particular individuals that are uncontroversially, right, regarded as really great examples of moral goodness, really great people, moral saints, as it were. And to model our lives, our actions, our states after what we find in those people. So that's what we get. That's not going to give us a particularly precise formula for what sort of actions we should perform if we want to become morally virtuous. But it does give us something like a guideline. We should aim for somewhere in the middle, says the principle of the mean, and then we should look to exemplars, great examples of moral virtue, to model our lives against theirs. So those are two general rules that we can use to get us there. Now I think we're ready to introduce Aristotle's complete definition of virtue. Here's a definition that he gives in Book 2, Section 6. He says, a virtue is a deliberately chosen state, a state that is a sort of mean, a mean relative to us, which is defined by reason, which is defined as the practically wise or prudent person would define it, and which lies between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. Now that is a really long definition. I count maybe 7 key parts or ingredients to that definition. Well, we know that virtue is a state. It's not just a feeling of capacity, but it's a state you're in, being disposed to act in a particular way. We know that it has to be deliberately chosen because we know that the good qualities that you have, the state that you're in, is not about what you were born with. It's about what you have habituated in yourself. So it is deliberately chosen because it's something that you've taken on voluntarily as a project to make yourself into a certain sort of person. We also know, based on his principle of the mean, that the state is a sort of mean. What we should be aiming for is somewhere in the middle, which we can use reason to help us determine. We can use reason to help us determine where the extremes would be and where the middle would be with respect to a particular domain. But he also adds this interesting further element to it. This is ingredient 3 in his definition. Now this one is 4, a mean relative to us. Now what does he mean by that? So he says that we're aiming for the middle, right? We should be aiming for those actions and those states that are somewhere in the middle. Between what? Between deficiency and excess, right? There are vices, there are bad habits, there are bad character traits that lie on each side. Once again, think of food, right? Someone who eats too much is a glutton, and someone who doesn't eat nearly enough, right, is someone who is damaging themselves, right? They have the eating disorder or something like that, right? There's a vice on each side. And he says that we should be aiming for somewhere in the middle. But he also says that where that middle is for you might be slightly different than where the middle is for someone else. Now, he's not a relativist, right? He's not saying anything goes. Well, you just shoot for your own middle, whatever you want. No. What he's saying is just that we're all going to be aiming for the middle, but depending on a couple things about you in particular, your middle could shift a bit compared to someone else. Well, what are the things that matter? Well, it could be your particular profession, or it could be your particular natural constitution. So, for example, think of food again. How much food is somewhere in the middle, not too much and not enough? Well, it depends on what your profession is, right? If you are a professor, I don't need to eat very much in order to do my job. But if I was a training athlete trying to bulk up, what I would need in order to do that, right, would be way more calories than what I consume as a professor. But still, even in both of those cases, there would still be extremes. Even when you're bulking up, there's still, right, eating too much that would be harmful, or eating the wrong sorts of things, or certainly not eating enough. And a professor, right, there's a not eating enough, such that I need to make sure that I get at least that. So the mean shifts based on your profession and your natural constitution, but it doesn't mean anything goes. It just means you have to pay attention to the particularities of your situation. Also packed in his definition. So far we got that virtue is a deliberately chosen state that is a sort of mean, a mean relative to us, which is defined by reason, and which lies between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. The last ingredient, number 6, is actually the one I want to focus on, which he says, which is defined as the practically wise or prudent person would define it. This is essentially the exemplar principle. Because what they're saying is you can help figure out what the mean is by looking at these practically wise or prudent persons, these exemplars, these great examples of moral virtue, to help you figure out what sort of action and what sort of state that you should be aiming for. So put this all together, then we get Aristotle's 7-part definition of virtue, which you should know. A virtue is a deliberately chosen state, a state that is a sort of mean, a mean relative to us, which is defined by reason, which is defined as the practically wise or prudent person would define it, and which lies between two vices, one of excess and one of deficiency. Now, tie this back once again to the notion of happiness. Once again, happiness is an excellent activity of the soul in accord with involving reason in accord with virtue over a complete life. Now, the virtue component of happiness is an important one. It means that not only do you have to be doing the right sort of thing, you have to have the right sort of qualities that make you a certain sort of person. And what are those qualities? Intellectual virtues and moral virtues. And here in Book 2, we've talked about how to get the moral virtues. You get them through practice until you're disposed to act by second nature, or sort of something becomes almost second nature to you. You've also conditioned your tastes and your preferences. You are aiming for the mean. You're using your exemplars to help you guide. You're using your reason to identify the extremes. You are keeping careful track of the particularities of your situation, which might shift the mean. And when you do that, right, when you habituate those sorts of characteristics that fit this definition, Aristotle thinks, you will have the right sort of qualities that allow you to fulfill your function and to live up to your complete nature as a human being. So that's the general account of virtue, and that's its connection to happiness. What would be really nice to get are some particular examples of virtues, so we know maybe what we should be aiming for, maybe some particular examples of things that we should be avoiding to help us out, so that we know what sort of character traits to be going for. And that's what I want to talk about next time, is I want to talk about Aristotle's account of particular virtues, because that will lead us into a discussion of what I'm going to ask you to do for your next writing assignment. So that's what we'll do next. Thanks very much.